I guess I'll just go ahead and I'll start talking about my recent research in Peru, on the Moche of Peru. The first part will deal with whether or not the southern Moche eventually developed statehood. And this is kind of an expanded version, although it's going to be fairly superficial, of a talk I'll be giving here in the next few weeks down in Florida on potentially the incorporation of a valley by the Moche, the southern Moche state, and the evidence that I have. So in any case, when we're talking about a state, this is kind of bread and butter anthropology, or at least certainly bread and butter archaeology. There are a number of pristine or primary states that are well known to anthropologists and archaeologists. The Andes being one of the locations where states seem to have arisen without contact or foreknowledge of other states. And so one of the things, of course, that we anthropologists are interested in understanding is how and why these things emerge, how and why we have these similar patterns that we see in various locations around the world. One of the first people to kind of define very classically for us different kinds of societies would be Elman Service. In his book on Origins of the State and Civilization, the Process of Cultural Evolution, he gave us, and I won't talk very much about this, but he gave us kind of the four basic kinds of socio-political organization that we often teach in our classes. If you've taken P200 with me, you've certainly heard me talk about this. I don't know if Dr. Kusnar, if you talk about this kind of stuff, but band-level societies and tribes being what are referred to as acephalous kinds of societies. They don't have centralized authority or laws per se. They're more social sanctions. And then chiefdoms and states, these are more centralized kinds of societies that do, at least as defined by Service and subsequently other anthropologists and archaeologists, they do differ in a number of important qualitative ways. Chiefdoms being led by primarily a head individual, and generally social rank within these societies is based upon kinship and how closely or distantly related you are to that particular chief. In both cases, these are agricultural societies, and there's IPFW again. Agricultural societies that have surplus, but one of the main distinctions is that state-level societies have very large-scale industrial forms of agriculture and have typically tried to develop apparatus to harness that surplus, that agricultural surplus, namely things like storage silos, as well as a bureaucracy, and I can discuss some of these other things. So kind of a laundry list of things that are often associated with state-level societies. This is a kind of a classic laundry list of things that archaeologists have kind of worked out. State leaders, a state religion, a state art that is often used as a form of propaganda to spread the state's ideology. A bureaucracy, and this is something that I'll kind of talk about a little bit more. Social stratification that is not necessarily kin-based, but there are often ways of achieving higher status or through accumulating wealth, increasing one's rank within these societies. Monumental architecture, along with specialized monumental features, not just a pyramid, but perhaps palaces and other kinds of palatial structures. Valley-wide integration, when we're talking about state-level societies. They eventually somehow, through some process, incorporate other communities within this particular political system. I already talked about intensive agriculture and related infrastructure. That can include things like, and almost invariably does include things like irrigation canals, storage systems, quite often intensive kinds of agricultural equipment, things like hoes and plows and so on and so forth. Tribute and taxation, and these are kind of important. While chiefdoms are often considered to be redistributive in nature, there are materials that often flow to the center to the chief, who then he or she will distribute them as he or she sort of sees fit. This is a little bit different in state-level societies where you have a formal mechanism with expected levels of tribute, kind of a form of labor tax, or sometimes what is ever produced, whether it's agricultural products or if you're a ceramicist, a share of your time and production will go towards the state. Often an accounting system, the existence of laws that are not necessarily whimsically, well, they can be whimsically determined, but laws which are established by the state and enforced by the state, sometimes using a standing army, a professional warrior class that is separate, as well as long-distance conquest. And invariably, what most scholars on the topic recognize is that states, pristine states, often go through a very systematic process of evolving from acephalous kinds of societies into chiefdoms, subsequently into complex chiefdoms, and then eventually states. And that in no instance in the pristine states or primary states that have been recognized do they not go through a period during which they're characterized by kind of more chiefly societies. One of the classic and fairly well, I guess this was, I didn't read it at the time. When did this come out, Larry? It was like in the 57 or something like that. So I wasn't around when this came out. Very influential book by Karl Wittfogel on Oriental despotism, where he suggested that irrigation being very important in state-level societies basically played a role and necessitated individual leaders and kind of necessitated the state. But what has been found, or what was one of the critiques of this, was that in many instances you have for centuries smaller level, sometimes communities or somewhat acephalous or perhaps even simple chiefdoms that had irrigation canals without necessarily evolving into states. Somebody else who is really quite influential, and there's still a degree of validity to some of his arguments, and somewhat importantly, he did a lot of his ethnographic research in South America and then subsequently used the Moche and other South American polities as examples in his work, is the circumscription theory articulated by Robert Carneiro. And basically what he suggested was that populations that became states, or in regions where people developed state-level societies, they would somehow be circumscribed and limited in part by environmental factors. And in the case of the Moche in particular, desert, as I'll kind of discuss and show, desert areas surrounding very lush agricultural fields, and that eventually you have this kind of almost feedback, and this is kind of a more evolved version of Carneiro's ideas, where you have this increasing population size that is restricted by the environment and begins to outstrip its local agricultural productivity. What he kind of argued, though, was that there would be kind of nascent conflict within valleys that would then eventually, one of the polities or political organizations within the valley would eventually conquer the other polities or competing groups within the valley. And this is where he thought warfare was kind of important, and eventually perhaps that they would then expand beyond their valley confines. Charles Spencer, he is also a scholar at the American Museum of Natural History, much as Robert Carneiro is. Both are still alive and kicking. And he's still publishing quite a bit on these kind of neo-evolutionary comparative kinds of studies on how and why states emerged. And he's contributed a couple of very important things about states, and he has argued that yes, indeed, you actually must have bureaucracy evolve, but that bureaucracy evolves when there is competition with other competing polities, and that warfare, too, is absolutely critical for states to emerge. That you need a separate warrior class and a necessary bureaucracy, not only for managing the agriculture and things of that sort, but actually that you need these kind of separate administrative categories of people that emerge in times of conflict. And this is really the important trigger, and occurs quite quickly, he argues, in some of his comparative work with the Oaxaca Valley and Moche Valley and all these other places. There have been, however, a number of critics of this kind of quote-unquote neo-evolutionary work. People such as Timothy Pocketet at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I'm not going to get myself into trouble here. I'm not going to go out on a limb and offer my opinion on this particular book. I find this one really it just gets under my skin. He tries to copy what Kent Flannery did in the 1960s with the Golden Marshalltown, and it doesn't come off well. But he does try to make some critiques and arguments that there's no such thing as a chiefdom as articulated by Service and others, that this is kind of a fantasy, and that our labels don't really seem to completely capture the range of variation, and that this is really kind of a continuum of different kinds of societies. And similarly, up at the University of Michigan, Norman Yoffe, one of the most important current archaeological theory guys, he makes very similar arguments regarding states, and argues that in no case does a state conform in these pristine state locations. Do they actually conform to the laundry lists that others have kind of come up with and use in their research when trying to understand the emergence of the state? So the Moche, which of course are very near and dear to my heart, have played an important role in these kind of discussions. And there are discussions and battles, as I'll kind of talk about here in a few minutes, regarding what the Moche were. And there is a long history, a long trajectory of research in this particular region. It begins in the 19th century, actually. But this particular region where we find the Moche is on the north coast of Peru. The influence that we see associated with Moche archaeological culture extends from the Piura Valley in the north all the way down to the Warme in the south. And there are important data regarding the valleys and how much agricultural productivity there is, how much irrigation discharge there is, that has been used to make arguments, and I'll kind of perhaps allude to some of this a little bit later, regarding just how productive and how many people existed during this period during which the Moche existed in each of the valleys. So, for example, in the Moche Valley, it's really only thought to be about 51,000 people, and in some of the adjacent valleys, larger numbers of people could have been supported, and farther south, fewer people. But in any case, this does come into play. As I had mentioned, in this particular region, I don't suspect most people are familiar with this. It is a desert, but within river valleys, there are lush irrigated agricultural fields. This is primarily glacial melt and rainfall that occurs in the adjacent highlands during the austral or southern hemisphere winter months, or summer months, our winter months, that then gets funneled down through these valleys and is used to irrigate the fields. Along the coastline on the north coast, there are these very broad coastal belts, relatively flat, closer to the ocean, and this is where the Moche kind of emerged. Some of the things that we know about the Moche, and one of the reasons why they've often been the source of study, is because of their really impressive artistry in the areas of ceramics, for example, and what we know based upon their ceramics, as well as somewhat confirmed through archaeological excavations of housing structures, burials, is that they were a socially stratified society. Very clearly, they were a socially stratified society. There's very good evidence from both their iconography on their ceramics as well as other kinds of archaeological evidence, far too detailed to get into here, that there was that this was a society based upon tribute. And here, this isn't the only example. There's lots of examples of people bringing things such as, in this case, strombus shells. Other instances show people bringing textiles and paying tribute. One of the things that we find in each of the valleys associated with Moche cultural influence are these massive mud brick pyramids. This one here is the largest mud brick pyramid in the world, the Pyramid of the Sun, or Huaca del Sol, and it is literally 4 football fields long and over 150 feet high. It's really just massive. One of the interesting things that was documented as early as the 19th century, however, was that this structure, as well as other Moche pyramids, were constructed in a segmented fashion using these adobes or mud bricks. And one of the interesting things that was very well documented by Mike Mosley during the Chan Chan Moche Valley project was that within each of these columns, so this would be a dividing line between the tops of 2 columns, you have these distinct markings on the adobes within each of the columns. And this has been suggested to represent kind of labor tribute that went towards the construction of this. Even still today, in many Andean communities, communities are expected to contribute a certain amount of work to maintain public goods. And they will often keep count of it using systems such as this, just random symbols to represent the community or the family that contributed. These pyramids were decorated or adorned with very colorful mud brick friezes, as we see here. And these are just some of the other kinds of art forms, the ceramics, such as fine line vessels that I have up there, really amazing metallurgy. All of these things are things that we find associated with Moche society wherever we find evidence for its cultural influence. One of the really important archaeologist was a Peruvian by the name of Rafael Larco, who in the 1940s, he was basically a looter, but he collected more than 40,000, actually more than 100,000 vessels. Just amazing. This is within his modern day hacienda in Lima, where they have all of his stuff on display. He's now dead, but they turned his collection into a museum. It's really quite remarkable. But he gave us this 5-phase sequence for the Moche based upon his study of their ceramics. And he argued that the Moche evolved out of this earlier Gallinazo people, represented by these kind of black over red kind of negative kinds of ceramics. He, because of his familiarity with archaeology and the ruins within the region, at this particular site, the quote-unquote Moche site, or as it's sometimes referred to, Huacas de Moche, or Pyramids at Moche, 2 massive, massive mud brick pyramids, as we can kind of see here. This doesn't look like very much, and this was before the modern day excavations at the site, but really quite complex architecture under these kind of sand-blown dunes that are covering the site today, as well as a massive urban sector. And this is how we think at least the pyramids, well, we know the pyramids would have looked at the time of occupation. This one back here, the Pyramid of the Moon, this is the way this would have looked, just to give you some sense here. And it was adorned with these very colorful friezes that often, well, they do, depict naked-bound warriors that are being brought in by victorious warriors. This is kind of a depiction of the victorious warriors leading in the naked-bound warriors and celebrating elites above them, and then kind of the pantheon of Moche deities above them in this massive plaza. One of the things that Larco also noticed was that beginning with his phase 3, that we start to see these very militaristic themes almost exclusively, not quite exclusively, but almost exclusively in Moche ceramics. So things such as this, and I have an example of a fine line ceramic with two individuals doing battle on it here. That's a replica. They're replicas. In any case, some other colleagues of mine have painstakingly drawn these scenes, and they're scenes that when you roll them out, actually you can get a better sense of what was going on. And in this particular scene, we see evidence of warriors doing battle with one another with maces and shields. This is yet another one looking at kind of a river here, and you've got all these people doing battle with one another one-on-one. Sometimes we do see evidence of Moche perhaps doing battle with people who don't resemble Moche, but in most instances, the individuals that they're doing battle with kind of resemble one another. I'll come back to that. In any case, the other thing that Larco noticed, as well as other scholars have noticed, is that you then have these depictions quite often of warriors being captured, paraded around nude, apparently being put on some form of trial or being presented to an elite individual, as indicated by the massive ear spools and the headdress and back flap and things of that sort. They're subsequently being tortured, and then they're being led to being sacrificed. So what Larco then hypothesized back in the 1940s and 50s was that the Moche began in the Moche Valley and were an expansionist state that then eventually conquered the entire North Coast. And this was the primary model really right up until certainly the 1990s, and I would say even to some degree still today. Maybe not many scholars, but there are still a couple who hold on to this model. But Moche archaeology was largely confined to looking at looted ceramics and not so much a lot of archaeology. There were a couple of notable projects in the 1970s and 1960s, but it really wasn't until 1987. And I guess I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but this is one particular ceramic, and I have a replica of this as well. This is referred to as the presentation or the sacrifice theme. And one of the things that Larco certainly argued was that this was part of their religious ideology, this notion of regenerating the cosmos through human sacrifice, the collection of warrior blood. And this is this particular ceramic rolled out. Here we have this individual who was identified subsequently by someone by the name of Christopher Donnan as the radiant being who's being presented a cup of blood by this bird priest. Yet another attendant, the priestess. It wasn't known that she was a priestess when they first, there's multiple copies of this ceramic. But it wasn't known that it was a female until much more recently. But in any case, the priestess, and then a feline priest who is also one of the attendants at the ceremony. And in the foreground, the way that Moche would represent things in their artistic canons, here we have the radiant being's litter, his mace or staff, and then you have captured warriors' bundles. This would be the shield, the dart throwers, and mace. And they are naked and bound and having their throats slit and their blood collected by attendants in cups of blood. It wasn't until 1987 when, actually because of looting activity, that at the site of Sipan, there was a really wonderful tomb, the most elaborate tomb with the most grave goods of any tomb discovered to this point in the New World. This individual, the Lord of Sipan, we now recognize based upon his burial offerings as being this individual, the radiant being that is in the sacrifice theme or the presentation theme. And subsequent to 1987, and in part because of this particular discovery, Moche archaeology has kind of taken off, and there are a number of ongoing projects in different valleys that have started to uncover a lot more information about the Moche and filling in a lot of the gaps. There are still lots of questions, but subsequently we have identified all of the individuals, all of the elite individuals in the sacrifice theme. We also now have extensive archaeological evidence that they were indeed, as I had mentioned, a stratified, socially stratified society. with paramount leaders and then attendants and other kinds of elites that seem to have played different administrative roles. However, in part because of the more recent interest in Moche archaeology beginning in the 1990s, a number of scholars started to question the sequence that had been laid out by Larco in terms of what the ceramics represent, where they were found. Was Moche 1 found only in the Moche Valley? Was it found elsewhere? What about Moche 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and so on and so forth? And then even more recently, individuals such as Jeffrey Quilter, depicted here, as well as a student of his, Michelle Coons, depicted here. This is at the SAAs in Memphis a few years ago. They have started to question whether, and this is probably a better representation of that night. It's total blur. But it's total blur. Anyways, they've started to question and in fact have argued that the Moche do not represent a state and that there's absolutely no evidence for there being a state. None whatsoever. So anyways, so this nice sequence that was laid out by Larco has certainly taken a bruising over the past couple of decades. One of the things that we do know is that Gallinazo ceramics that he kind of argued, and there's some evidence in some places at some times that yes, indeed, Moche ceramics and society kind of evolved out of this pre-existing Gallinazo. But we also have evidence that this kind of coexisted and persisted in certain valleys right up throughout the entire Moche sequence. So it wasn't this nice sequential evolution out of Gallinazo into Moche necessarily. But there has been also a revision. His ceramics of 1 and 2 have been collapsed. They're now known to be contemporaneous. And what we know is that there's a lot more variation in the ceramics than what he originally recognized. So here we have Viru, which is it's related to Gallinazo, but a different ceramic, and Vicus up here in the farther north. And this Gallinazo domestic persists throughout the sequence and is found in association actually with all these different kinds of Moche ceramics. In the north, we now refer to these earlier Moche ceramics as early Moche, whereas in the southern region, we refer to them as Moche 1 and 2, Moche 3 or middle Moche, and then late Moche. And one of the interesting things that we now recognize is that Moche 4, which is associated with some sort of expansion we see this very widespread in certain areas, is also sometimes associated with Moche 5, which was thought to be much later. And there's all kinds, I could go on and on about Moche 5, but I won't. That's not the topic of today's talk. So it is now the general consensus that what we have is a sphere of northern Moche influence, where there doesn't seem to have been really any, there really isn't any evidence that we have identified thus far for an expansionist kind of polity of some sort. And then there's the southern Moche sphere of influence. And it's this region that I'll be kind of focusing on. The north and the south really do have very different pyramids, different ceramics that they were using. Today we recognize them as being related culturally, but very different socio-political developments going on in those different regions. So in any case, in the southern Moche region, I've presented and have a publication coming out eventually with a colleague of mine on the emergence of the Moche within the Moche Valley. And within the Moche Valley, we do have a pretty clear sequence, almost as described by Larco, Rafael Larco decades ago, where we do have Gallinazo, or this kind of black over red kind of style of ceramic that persisted between about 200 BC to AD 200. And then you have kind of this emergence in elite, specifically in elite contexts of Moche 1-2 ceramics. And what we're arguing is that these were exclusive. During the early Moche phase, basically everywhere else throughout the valley quote-unquote commoners were still using Gallinazo-style ceramics, and that these early Moche ceramics emerged first as a way of kind of the elites distancing themselves from commoners, and they were used to provision other elites that were participating in this system within the valley with the elites at the pyramids at Moche's site. However, something really kind of interesting began around AD 400. You start to see massive construction going on at the quote-unquote Moche site. The development of administrative structures associated with the Pyramid of the Moon, or Huaca de la Luna. This is what we'd refer to as the Ule platform here, where administrators were buried. They are not the same as the religious elites that were buried at the adjacent Pyramid of the Moon. And the proliferation of specialized workshops, ceramicists, stoneworkers, textile workshops, ceramic production, more ceramic production, as well as massive storage facilities within each of these kind of walled-in barrios or neighborhoods associated with craft specialists. In other parts of the valley, at the same time, what we see is construction of a massive canal system that dramatically expands the agricultural productivity within the Moche Valley. And it's at this time when quote-unquote Moche 3 and 4 ceramics become widely disseminated. These bellicose kinds of ceramics, they become widely distributed. They're not just associated with elites and elite burials. People throughout the valley are, we would argue, being employed by the Moche, kind of being co-opted by the Moche, being brought into Moche ideology to perhaps compete with adjacent polities and adjacent valleys. And we even have evidence of administrators at some of these other sites. And these are ceramics associated with one elite tomb at, I guess you could say, beginning around AD 400 at this site that gets incorporated eventually around AD 400. And he has the exact same sorts of ceramics that we see with the elites that are buried at the administrative structures, the palatial structures at the Moche site. Settlement pattern studies indicate that very clearly this was a four-tier settlement system. And this is one of the characteristics that is argued to be associated with state-level societies. We also have evidence, and this is one of the things that I'll be presenting at my upcoming talk in Florida, for expansion out of the Moche Valley beginning around AD 4 to 500, somewhere in that time frame. And a lot of this is based upon radiocarbon dates that were just recently published at the end of last year. So in the Chicama Valley, and quite dramatically, at around AD 500, you see at the preeminent site, it basically becomes a mini-me version of the pyramids at Moche. You've got these two massive pyramids that are separated by this residential structure. Unfortunately, the residential structure is really highly looted. But within the pyramid, and in particular this one, Cao Viejo, as it began to become uncovered, it's an exact replica. The Moche created an exact replica of what was going on about 45 miles away to the south. Same sorts of friezes with elite celebrating warriors, as well as these naked bound warriors that are being led by other victorious warriors. These are some of the friezes. And one of the things I always like to point out at this particular site, they have remains that are embedded into the friezes. Instead of using pegs in the mortar to hang the friezes on the adobes, here you've actually got within the feet of these celebrating elite human bones that have been cut out of individuals, of males. We also have within the plaza immediately in front of these friezes sacrificial victims. There's only about 8 of them, but 8 is better than nothing, right? And this is what I'm kind of interested in. In any case, we then have evidence to the south, immediately to the south, that probably what the Moche from the Moche Valley did, they expanded into this particular valley. There's a site that springs up at about AD 500 at Huaca de la Cruz with an elite individual who's buried there, has all kinds of staffs, and had 3 sacrificed women associated with him. Another site that seems to be trying to emulate Moche ceramics at Huancaco, and yet perhaps what the Moche had done was they struck an alliance, because other than these 2 sites, there really isn't much of a Moche presence in the valley, and we have a persistence of Gallinazo right up until AD 850, concomitant with the presence of these Moche. So it's not an uncommon strategy for people to kind of co-opt local elites, if that makes sense, and get them to do the bidding, do the administrating of things going on in the valley. In the Santa Valley to the south of the Viru, it's a little bit different. Beginning around AD 350, 400, we see the presence of early Moche ceramics at one site, and then a dramatic expansion beginning at around AD 500 of agricultural lands, and the presence of numerous Moche sites with elite Moche ceramics that look as though they could have been produced at the Moche site itself. And in fact, at one particular site, well, actually, I'm sorry, 3 sites, sorry, they have the molds that were being used that could have been made from Moche's ceramic sites from the Moche site itself to be mass-produced within the Santa Valley. The Moche also constructed a road system connecting all of the principal pyramids within the Chicama, the Moche, and the Viru and Santa Valleys. And there are fragments of roads going farther south, but whether they were directly connected is speculative. They've been destroyed by looters in agricultural fields. We also have evidence at the Pyramid of the Moon, at the main Moche site, evidence of sacrificial victims. And I'm going to kind of present this sequentially in the order of my research. Originally, I started working on remains that have been excavated at Plaza 3A, which is more recent. And then subsequently, as they dug down into the pyramid, they discovered additional earlier human sacrifices from another plaza, Plaza 3C. And just to kind of give you some sense, all of these were adult males, very healthy, healthier than the general population, very robust, more robust than most males from the general population. They had really high frequencies of both healed as well as healing fractures in their skeletons. These are bone calluses that start growing once you've had a bone that's fractured, and that's what we'd refer to as a peri-fracture. Numerous individuals with varying degrees of healing going on from these kinds of peri-fractures or well-healed cranial fractures on the left side of the head that were probably incurred through being struck by somebody who was wielding a right-handed weapon. What we know in terms of their treatment was that almost invariably we have evidence that these individuals were tortured. Noses broken, bones flayed. This is the internal part of the jaw. This individual had the floor of their mouth cut out as well as their tongue, being pulled apart, strewn about, and buried without clothing. Some of these individuals, you can see the articulated remains. Some of the individuals very clearly had cut marks on their faces, on their noses, resembling flayed faces of captured warriors in Moche ceramics. In terms of their manner of death, some of the things that we know, they had their throats slit quite often from the front, cut marks here, right across these upper vertebrae. Their skulls were bashed in. And in terms of how they were treated after the fact, at Plaza 3C, the earlier part of the sequence, they were buried in the floors of the Huaca, of the pyramid. Just showing some of the remains there, thrown into the floor, jammed into holes that were dug into the mud brick pyramid. I love this one. It's just got the feet and the skull. But anyways, these individuals were flayed. They were completely defleshed, and my colleague John Verano thinks that they were kind of suspended like skeletons, leaving like their ligamentous and tendinous attachments so that they could be dangled and used in ceremonies. We've got Moche ceramics, I've got one in my office, that shows like these dancing and celebrating dead. It's kind of macabre. In any case, I started out back like a decade ago looking at the individuals from Plaza 3A where they'd been sacrificed in front of this rocky outcrop here, strewn about in mud from the mud brick pyramid, and I'm not going to talk about that. Left out to decay. We've even got the muscoid fly pupa that lay their eggs in rotting flesh. And what I use are these dental characteristics. These are cusps and roots, the cusp number, cusp size. We know that these are genetically influenced. In some very few instances, we know the actual genes associated with their expression. But these have been used to successfully reconstruct known relationships amongst living people, and often they perform better than genetics do, believe it or not. Don't ask me why. In any case, I study these and I develop what are referred to as biological distances. They are very similar to genetic distances between different populations. And so one of the questions that I was looking at was who these Moche sacrificial victims were, because the long-standing ideas were they were just local warriors. They staged these ritual battles amongst the elites from the Moche site during the agricultural calendar and would sacrifice some of them to their deities, right? So I compared them to a bunch of different Moche, both from outside of the valley as from within the valley. And then subsequently I studied the ones, this is the first publication. They stick out like a sore thumb. They're definitely not local, right? I'm not going to say much about that because I'm running out of time. Subsequently studied the earlier ones from Plaza 3C, and they stick out like a sore thumb. One of the intriguing things that I found, though, was that the ones from Plaza 3C were more similar to the local population, although still not similar, than those to the more recent ones from 3A. And what I argued was that, first of all, these were professional warrior elites, but that through time the Moche started expanding, and of course if you're conquering nearby people first, they're going to be more similar to your local population. But as you extend and expand outward, the people are going to be more and more different from the local population. So in any case, the earlier Plaza 3C victims likely drawn from closer polities or adjacent valleys, and the ones from Plaza 3A, as the Moche expanded, drawn from other valleys. And that brings me to the research from last summer. So last summer, I started working on more recent sacrificial victims from yet another platform at the Moche site. This is platform 3, and it dates more recent or later in the Moche sequence. This dates to, this one was about in Plaza 3A, about AD 600. This is AD 700 to 900. And it was in these plazas where they actually found the remains, same sorts of patterns. Adult males and late adolescent males had their throats slit, heads bashed in, faces flayed. That's the orbit. This is part of your cheek here. And my analyses indicate, once again, that these individuals are coming from even farther afield. But the interesting thing, I was able to study this past summer individuals from that adjacent pyramid where the Moche had basically reconformed the pyramid to make it look as though it was like the Moche site itself. And look at where the Plaza 3A victims, who date to the same time period when that site was transformed, they cluster right with these people from this particular valley, the Chicama Valley. And so what I'm going to be arguing is that these were indeed captured prisoners of war who were taken back from the Chicama Valley and then executed. These were executed prisoners of war. Some of the stable isotope analysis confirms this, and I love when this happens. This is some of the older analysis from my colleague Mara Latoine, who's also going to be presenting this upcoming April, and her data indicate that the diets of the sacrificial victims was significantly different from that of the local folks, and far too complicated to get into here, but the sacrificial victims that she has, those from Plaza 3A, she argues were indeed coming from the Chicama Valley, and that later in the sequence they were indeed coming from farther afield. So our data sets jive very, very well. So to evaluate, whether or not the Moche actually had some of these processes in place, I would argue that they certainly did, and I would argue that my very good friends, Jeffrey Quilter and Michelle Coons, have perhaps neglected to consider some of the different kinds of evidence that we have. Were the Moche emerging as a state everywhere in all places? No. But at the Moche site itself, within the Moche Valley, I think the evidence is really quite compelling. They were clearly a society that was characterized by rank, very highly socially stratified. It was a society that had very clearly the presence of a bureaucracy. It was a society where you had craft specialization along with storage facilities. A society that had a 4-tier settlement pattern with professional warriors that then conquered settlements from adjacent or nearby valleys. So in sum, and the road system. And what I would argue is all the sacrificial activity is what Robin Beck has referred to as persuasive politics. Through brutality and coercion, you're scaring your potential opponents and perhaps drawing people into the fold lest similar things happen to them. So just to kind of summarize here, settlement pattern, storage, etc., speak to the presence of a state within the Moche Valley as well as a bureaucracy. The conquest of El Brujo in the adjacent Chicama Valley certainly speaks to an expansionist nature of the Moche from the Moche Valley. And then probably what was going on was negotiation and then conquest in the valleys to the south. And very clearly, these prisoners were not local people. These were people that were captured from other farther afield valleys where the Moche from this Moche Valley seemed to have stuck their fingers in and tried to conquer things. So I think it's a little premature to say that they were not a state, or at the very least, perhaps they were not a long-lived state, but they certainly had, they were maybe a failed state, but they had a lot of the processes in place for emerging into something quite state-like. Am I concerned with, does it pigeonhole perfectly into what we have in our laundry list as a state or not? No. What I'm more interested in is what are some of the processes associated with how this kind of complexity emerges? And very clearly, the Moche within the Moche Valley were developing the apparatus that we typically associate with states. Were they a state yet? Maybe, maybe not, but they were clearly on the road to becoming a state. They had all the things associated with it. So just very briefly, and I'm going to have to skip dramatically here. So I've also been very intrigued by the fact that, by and large, what we use in these kinds of populational studies that I do are adult teeth. But we've got kids' teeth too, right? And kids' teeth have the same sorts of characteristics, but they're not utilized. Nobody uses them, rarely anyways, in biodistance studies. And what Tanvi Chatiawala and I were kind of interested in was determining whether or not the juvenile teeth can produce the same sorts of results that we see that we get from the adult teeth. And unfortunately, I'm not really going to be able to talk about this in very much detail, but we focused in this particular valley outside of the southern Moche realm of influence in the Hecate Valley. Kind of interesting, the evolution of the valley, it expanded as well, and then you have this movement of all the sites inland during a period of drought. There's evidence for nascent combat going on within the valley. All the sites become fortified. Those are all sling stones. And then what we do know about the valley is that there's no cemeteries save one. And we think that people were all transporting their loved ones, this is a mummy bundle, to the specific, and this is a mummy bundle depicted in the Moche ceramics from the region, to a specific site called San Jose de Moro. And one of the kind of cool or interesting things about the site, it has more than 1,000 years of burials represented at this particular site. In fact, it's still used to some degree to date. We have these discrete areas where earlier middle Moche, and then, well, these are middle Moche, late Moche, and then post-Moche burials are found. And I'm not going to be able to talk about this at all, but we do have evidence for foreigners coming into the valley during the time period of warfare. And I'm just going to skip through this. And I'm going to skip through that, and I'm going to skip through this, and I'm going to skip through this, and this. Sorry. But what we do have evidence for from the adult teeth is that there's evidence for extra-local gene flow into the area as we get these foreigners coming into the region. And so what Tanvi and I did, Tanvi collected data on juvenile teeth to see whether or not only the biodistance results, but also the evidence of genetic variability, which we have evidence for increases through time from the adult teeth, whether or not the juvenile teeth also present the same story. So this is Tanvi back in 2013, working on the dentitions there, along with Shauna Folis. She did a different kind of study using the teeth. These are the scoring sheets. Yes, and we were all put on TV in Peru, but anyways, okay. So what we see is that the estimates of genetic variation, as well as the overall biodistance results, are highly correlated with one another. In other words, the results are essentially indistinguishable from the juvenile teeth from those produced by the adult teeth. And so what we do know is that they are producing the same sorts of results. And we're encouraging other people to kind of explore the use of these deciduous tooth traits for estimating degrees of genetic variation in population movements in the past. They're really underutilized, and this is going to be, mark my words, it will be like a touchstone paper on this particular topic. Nobody's ever done this kind of research, and an IPFW student got to actually collect the data and do the research. So if you see Tanvi, tell her congratulations. It was great stuff. In any case, I don't think I have much time left for questions, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free. Yeah?
Well, I was just curious if anybody has mentioned, in regards to the emergence of complex societies as a source, has anybody mentioned instinct? Is that discussed?
Instinct in what way?
In the same way, like an ant, if you took two different ants and dropped one in South America and one in Egypt, and
well, but what instincts for
the emergence of statehood?
I think so. I think there is perhaps, I wouldn't necessarily call it instinct in the same way as with ants, but I do think that people try to use and manipulate others to get things that they want. And when you have surplus and social inequities, it's not necessarily something that will result, because we have a number of examples where states did not emerge, places such as North America. Cahokia, nobody argues that that was a state. It was a very complex chiefdom, but there's some interesting reasons why at least theoreticians of state-level societies argue that Cahokia did not, or Moundsville did not emerge into states. So sure, is there manipulation of individuals by some people? Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where you can't say, because the vast majority of our evolutionary history was not spent in state-level societies, right?
Right, but perhaps with like population and food source?
There are certainly constraints that we see associated with the emergence of complexity, but there's other kinds of things too, like surplus and manipulation of that surplus, distributing it to some and not others. That's manipulation, right? Anyways. Anybody else? Somebody? Yeah, Lauren.
So why are dental characteristics more useful than DNA for determining relatedness?
Okay, so one of the big problems has been mostly because the DNA analysis, especially on prehistoric populations, has been mitochondrial DNA. And so, for example, with Moche sacrificial victims, every single one has exactly the same mitochondrial DNA sequence as all the local individuals from the urban sector as well as the elites from the Moche site. Exactly the same. No variation whatsoever. And that was used, incidentally, in part to bolster the arguments that these are just all people from the same site that were just doing battle with one another. And no, they weren't a state-level society. No, they weren't expansionist. This was just like pageantry that was put on, and the loser of one-on-one battles would then give themselves willingly, or perhaps not so willingly, to the gods to be sacrificed, right? But that doesn't pan out with the data. And the stable isotope data really kind of demonstrates there's absolutely no way these people were, some of them perhaps, yes, were from the valley, but from farther inland. Yeah. They're not from the same valley, by and large. But yeah, I guess also in regards to teasing out modern living people, that's really not clear. And it might have to do with the scale or amount of DNA that is being kind of quote unquote sampled by the dental traits, that's being represented by the biodistances derived from the dental traits versus those that are being used by the nuclear DNA. It's not that nuclear DNA, for example, won't give us a quote-unquote correct answer, but it probably depends on how much of that variation you're sequencing and then using to derive genetic distances. Yeah.
It related to that, is it still the case that dental traits tend to be less genetically labile, more stable through time than a lot of other soft-bodied traits? And could that be a reason why they're better indicators of
partly
shared ancestry?
They have estimates of heritability on them, which doesn't necessarily tell you exactly how much, but in any case, they're between like 60 to 80% in terms of their heritability. Some of them seem to be evolutionarily stable, quote unquote, like, stable, not under a whole lot of natural selection. And in fact, a lot of them that are used are, at least hypothetically, under agricultural conditions selected against, and yet they persist.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sutter. We are out of
All right.
Thank you for coming in and giving the talk.
And if I can shamelessly plug my Moche seminar next semester on Tuesdays and Thursdays, all kinds of fun stuff.